Well, hey, friends, welcome to Awakening's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Carla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 29. This is going to be the first of two episodes where we are going to dive into the books of Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ruth. And we're really excited today to have back with us Dr. Beth Stovell. Dr. Stovell was with us a couple months back when we covered the 12 minor prophets. And so if you have yet to listen to those episodes, I would highly encourage you to go listen to those because she did an amazing job unpacking the 12 minor prophets. And so we're excited to have her back again. Dr. Stovell, welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule and joining us again for a couple more episodes.
Oh, I'm happy to be with you guys. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, I think it's going to be a good one. We've had some pretty interesting questions come in, and I think it's going to be fun to dive into that. For this first episode, we're going to focus really on the book of Proverbs and Song of Songs, and then the second episode that will be coming out shortly after this one, we're going to focus on the book of Ruth. So it's going to be some really engaging conversation. So listeners, I hope you are ready, and if you're ready, Dr. Stovell, we're going to dive right in so we can spend all our time chatting. Does that sound good?
Sounds perfect.
So this first question that came in actually refers to one of our previous podcasts that we released on the book of Job. So this is what they are asking. It says, how can we better appreciate Proverbs with all its incongruity between behavior and consequences? The prosperity gospel seems to ignore these. Jesus acknowledged that suffering doesn't always equate with sinfulness. In the podcast about Job, Mike Chu mentioned that Job's so-called friends seem to basically refer to Proverbs, so his revisiting this would be great. So let me pose this question to you first, and then we'll have Mike jump in since they reference what Mike mentioned in that Job podcast. But tell us your thoughts on this incongruity and what we should think about this.
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to start with just the basic premise that Proverbs tends towards the idea that behavior leads to particular consequences. So, in its most simple sense, we could say, like, be good and you'll get good, be bad and you'll get bad. But what's interesting is that that's not universal. Not all of the Proverbs do that. A lot of them do. But not every one of them does. In fact, there's parts of them that say the opposite. And so Raymond Van Leeuwen has a really helpful discussion about this, especially as it relates to wealth and poverty. So he talks about how there's 4 quadrants in Proverbs. So one of them, the quadrant 1, is wealth is associated with righteousness. So if you're righteous, you become wealthy and prosper. So that's quadrant 1. But quadrant 2 also exists, which is that those who are financially poor may also be righteous. And so 1 and 2 are about righteousness. Either those who are wealthy is a sign of their righteousness, but someone might be poor and be righteous, quadrant 2. So then there's 2 other quadrants around wickedness. So wealth can actually reflect someone who is wicked. They may have acquired their wealth through wicked ways. And so that's quadrant 3. And then the one that we think of maybe more typically, which is wickedness or foolishness can lead to poverty. And that's quadrant 4. So when you think about these, the ones that a prosperity gospel would emphasize would be 1 and 4. So wealth, you get wealth if you're righteous, and if you're wicked or foolish, you get poverty. But it's really important to see that that's not the whole picture of what Proverbs gives us. So Proverbs says things like, it's better to be righteous and poor than wicked and wealthy. It's a really common one. And we also see this idea that there's injustice. So while Proverbs doesn't talk about injustice that much, when it does talk about it, it emphasizes this idea that the reasons that we get wealth and wickedness and poverty and righteousness is sometimes because the wicked are mistreating the poor. So when we're thinking about what that means more broadly for life, one of the things that we can say is this. If you read Proverbs selectively, if you just choose certain parts of it and ignore others, then you can come to the conclusions that Job's friends come to, which is we can look at someone's life and know if they were righteous or they were wicked or foolish based on whether or not good things come to them.
Okay.
But the problem is that doesn't actually tell us the whole story, even of the Proverbs themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't help us when we look at other parts of the Old Testament that make it very clear that frequently those who do good receive evil instead of receiving good. And we see that in Job, and we see that in other figures. Like we see throughout the Psalms, there is a righteous sufferer, someone who suffers, but they've been righteous. We see that in the prophets. Prophets emphasize that section of like injustice and its impacts. And so, what I want to say about this is really just that I think it's important to not be selective in our reading of the Bible for the parts that form a theology we want. And so there was a Bible that was out a long time ago. My husband had it. It was like handed down to him, but it was called the Good
Mm-hmm.
News Only Bible. And so it was very small. It only had mostly the New Testament, and there was almost no Old Testament. And even parts of Jesus's speeches had to be cut because it wasn't good news enough. And
Wow.
I'm completely serious. It was just like this very small, and that someone had decided, I want to share only what I think is the good news. And so what you miss though is huge parts of scripture that are
Mm-hmm.
actually helpful for us for learning and for growing, but were removed because this person was like, that's not my good news. I did an experiment like this with my students, and when I was teaching undergrad, I took quotes from Jesus out of context and like sections of them, and I put them alongside apocryphal gospels. And I didn't have any like verse references or anything. I just put them in, and I was like, which ones are Jesus and which ones aren't, just to see how they responded. And
Mm.
almost universally, whenever Jesus was very harsh or had like harsh judgment, they would say, "Oh, that's not Jesus," and then I'd have to like
Mm.
show them in the Bible that it was. And I think that this is something that we see happening with prosperity gospel, but not just the prosperity gospel, where we select the parts that we like and remove the parts that we don't, or just ignore them. And so I
Mm.
think this happens in the ignoring of certain books of the Bible. The wisdom books in general get ignored more than other books. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but also, I think it happens in ignoring parts of those books that make us uncomfortable, or that mean we have to look at things are not as simple as if I do good, I get good, and if I do bad, I get bad, and I can always tell when someone's done the right thing or hasn't.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, Mike, did you want
Mm.
to add to that?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it'll be helpful to clarify what I meant from the last podcast when we were going through the book of Job. That, like, the book of Job is a very fascinating book because most people would just assume, oh, it's the earliest book in the Bible. It was written way before, it was around the time of the patriarchs. And I'm not necessarily of that opinion anymore. Just because there do seem to be allusions to other wisdom literature, like the Book of Psalms,
Mhm.
like Proverbs, like Ecclesiastes. And even though Proverbs, the Proverbs themselves are not directly quoted, they're not word for word, but there is this echoing, this allusion to what you were talking about, Beth, about this whole entire, if I do good, I'll get good. If I do bad, I'll get bad. This theology of retribution. That's essentially, I think, how John Walton would have put it, where the idea is that if I do good things, then I will get good things back in return. If I do bad things, I'll get bad things. And it's like a very one for one. And so, like, an example of that would be in Job 5:17 to 18, where Eliphaz is giving this kind of proclamation about doing good and being blessed by God. And then there's an echo of that in Proverbs 3:11 and 12. And so there is not a word for word, but it's almost it's a similar idea that's being reflected. And it doesn't mean
Mhm.
Proverbs 3 is not truthful, but there is something that's going on with Job's friends in general that they are focused so much on this theology of retribution, that the only way my world made sense is that the good people, or people who do good things, get good things back. And so Job, since you're receiving bad things, the only way my worldview can make sense of that is to then assume you must have been an unrighteous person. And so thus there's this reflection, and it is coming from a very selective view of the scriptures, just focusing on Proverbs 3:11-12, for example, or other proverbs and other wisdom literature that focuses on this kind of principle of retribution, but doesn't take the zoom out wider landscape that the scriptures do understand. There are moments, though, when the wicked do prosper,
Yeah,
and there are moments when the righteous suffer. And that's the
absolutely.
reality of life. And Job is in the midst of the struggle of, I am feeling the incongruity of this theology of retribution right now, my
Yeah,
friends. Like,
yeah,
I have been a righteous person, but I have received harm. I have received suffering. I don't understand this. I want God to come and talk with me about this. And the friends are, of course, reacting of like, how dare you? and and so that was kind of what I was trying to go at with that last podcast, of just that the book of Job is, even in some sense, doing a little bit of satire with the wisdom literature that people tended to like. It's like,
yeah,
oh, I like this type of wisdom literature. I like that verse. And Job, it essentially is being used as a way to kind of satirize what people would think is a universal principle. 100% of the time it will always happen. And he's basically pointing out, not necessarily in
yeah.
in the
Something.
microcosm.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think we get the same tension even into the New Testament. You can see Jesus's followers just being like, "No, there's no way you're going to suffer
Mm-hmm.
because you are the glorious King." And so, like, to the point of Jesus
That's
having to
true.
say to Peter, get behind me, Satan, because Peter's refusing a path of suffering. And so, when we think about this question of incongruity, I mean, in some ways, Jesus, who is God, who is tortured, who experiences suffering, is like this big picture of something that we see resonating in the Old Testament as well. This idea that the righteous should not suffer, and yet they
Mm-hmm.
do. And what do we do with that? So a lot of times I teach this biblical theology of suffering and hope course. And one of the things I encourage my students to do is to think about suffering across the entire Bible, not just one section of it. And similarly, like, where is hope is not just in one section, but throughout. And I think this is one of those things that students get hung up on because sometimes their churches have told them um, some pretty, actually really, really difficult information because they assume that if something's bad is happening to them, they must have sinned or something.
Mhm.
They must have done something wrong. One of my friends years ago, she had a spinal injury, and her church was telling her that she wasn't healing because she was sinful.
Mm-hmm.
And this process for her of being able to, I spent some time, we just talked theologically about this, and the hope of Job and the passages that do question and actually bring up this incongruity was so hopeful for her. It was like, oh, you mean there's a whole bunch of people who suffer who are righteous?
Mhm.
And that was
Mhm.
really helpful for her to actually have a different framework. And so I think it's something that's important in the scriptures itself, but I do think it also resonates even with us today.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I, I think over the years, like, the book of Job has been like a major like theme for my own personal study, and it's even what I'm working on for my doctoral project. And one of the things that I've come around to is that like that theology of retribution is so, to put it in another way, it is in the minds of so many of us, especially maybe those of us who've gone to church and have heard
Mhm.
pastors and sermons that kind of give this impression: you do good, you get good; you do bad, you get bad. That we're
Mhm.
essentially, we have this perspective that the world is built on justice. And what the book of Job and other wisdom literature that go into the areas that people are uncomfortable with is that the world is not built on justice. The world is actually built on wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the grand themes of like what we see within the wisdom literature, of how even wisdom is personified as that she was with
Yes.
Yahweh at the beginning of all creation, of that she was actually there amidst in the creation account. And trajectory wise, that later on wisdom is later identified as being actually that Jesus is the wisdom of God.
Yes. Yeah.
And yet so amazingly, it's like, so then what happened to Jesus? He
Mm-hmm.
suffered and died on the cross. That the
Yeah.
wisdom of God experienced suffering and death.
Yeah.
What does that say? That the
Yeah.
world is built on wisdom. And
Yes.
so anyhow, so I mean that has just been, I keep on going back to that well, and I have
Yeah.
not been able to draw everything out from it. But
Well, it's interesting
that's
because, yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting because when I talk to students about that, they'll often kind of land in this space where Job is so resonant for them. But then they go, okay, but then what do I do with the Proverbs? Because so much of the Proverbs do speak as though the world is a space of justice, right? And it makes it
Yeah.
for some students hard to go back to them because it's like, well, then are the Proverbs purposeless if actually they don't lead to, they
Right.
don't lead to a great life? And what I often say to them is that the Proverbs are describing a world how things should be if
Mhm.
justice was the framework of the world. So if everything was just, then what we see in the majority of the Proverbs would be true. And in some ways, I feel like there's this helpful framework that there's a life of wisdom that you can live, that you can tilt your life towards. And Proverbs gives us that. And Job helps us to say, okay, but if I've lived my life that way and I haven't experienced all the flourishing that I hope for, I still have a reason or an understanding of that's not indicating that I haven't tried to live a life of wisdom. Like I think there are helpful partners in that
Yeah.
way.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think, yeah, I would agree, Beth. I think of the Proverbs now these days as this is what the world should look like
Mm-hmm.
if every person volitionally was giving their allegiance to the Creator God. Right?
Yeah.
That if we were ordering our lives in ways that were in line with his thoughts and his righteousness, then Proverbs makes sense. And that's what Proverbs ultimately is like desiring, is that we move
Mm-hmm.
towards that picture of justice. And
Mm-hmm.
in the book of Job, though, it really helps me to understand. But thank God the world is not actually built on justice itself, because we would be all doomed. and, and right, because of just like, well, if one of us just sort of messes up or forgets to do something, then the whole entire system breaks apart, because justice is right, wrong, white, black, and it's
Yes.
just, it's so unforgiving. And yet wisdom allows the breath that is
Mm-hmm.
needed for maturity and for growth and for development and progress, not like, oh, you just answered wrong, you're done for. And it's that beautiful tension of, this is what we want and long for, and in some sense what we know ultimately will come with the eschaton or with the new creation,
Yes.
but we're
Yeah,
not there yet.
exactly. Well, and it's why Proverbs also doesn't give you, not all the Proverbs are completely clear. So sometimes the Proverbs have to be read in a context with wisdom to even understand them. My favorite is the two Proverbs that say exactly the opposite thing within like one set of verses.
Mhm.
One says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly," and the other one says, "Answer a fool according to his folly," which seems like that should just be like either one of those is right or the other one's right. They can't both be right. But one of the things I appreciate about Proverbs is this sense that we need to be wise in particular situations that we're in, that it's not black and white in every single
Mm-hmm.
situation. I love to give the example with this particular proverb that if I am on Facebook or Twitter or some place in the social media world and someone is being foolish, it might not be the moment to try to answer them according to their folly, because that
Mm.
setting doesn't actually usually allow a person to change how they think. It's just kind
Yeah.
of like an echo chamber. So I'm kind of wasting my words and maybe even creating conflict I don't even need to necessarily create. But if I'm sitting with someone who's a friend of mine who's asking me for their, like, my perspective on something they're doing, and they're being foolish, but they're open to hearing a perspective that's a different perspective, to say, hey, I don't think this is the wisest thing for you, and here's why. Well, that's a great moment to answer a fool according to their folly, like to talk to them about what is foolish in a way that is compassionate and actually could cause change. And so I think that's the other thing, is that even though the Proverbs might read as black and white, they actually many times aren't.
Mm-hmm.
They're many times framed in a situation not of a world of justice, but a world of wisdom, as you described. And this idea
Mhm.
of, what does it look like to be wise, and to use the Proverbs in the right ways in those settings. So I think that that's also another interesting part of what we get.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
appreciate
great.
the
Now,
nuancing, and it was actually very wise, Beth. It's
yeah.
part of the. Well, I mean, like, it is kind of funny when you think about it, right? The compiler of even that like everyone always brings it up. I'm kind of glad that wasn't actually one of the questions. That's like almost like such like a stereotypical question to come up. But it's that interesting thing of like, well, if I'm the compiler and I'm putting these two proverbs together that probably came from two different contexts. It's like, in my mind as the writer, I would assume this is not a contradiction. This is a collection
Mhm.
of wisdom, and hopefully you, as a
Right.
person that's seeking wisdom, could wisely discern, why did I put these two together so close to one
Yes.
another? Because you would understand, oh, in real life, when I'm actually interacting with people, there are seasons and moments where it's just best to stay quiet, and there are other moments where I actually care about this person and the person's actually receptive.
Mm-hmm.
That it makes sense. There's almost this
Yeah.
intuitiveness. Because as you're even talking about, it's like, yes, I absolutely know people like that. Facebook, Twitter, whatever else, not the best avenue. But with a friend who is experiencing heartache, that's a time to speak life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great, guys. Awesome, awesome. Okay, let me jump us to the second question, because then we're going to hit a little break and then we'll come back and cover some more. But this second question that came in refers again to this previous podcast, so let's kind of stay in that vein. Their question says, "What are the primary differences between our Old Testament proverbs and those of other A&E cultures?" Which I believe Dr. Hernandez mentioned in the last podcast. So talk to us a little bit about that, and then Mike, if you want to jump in again and refer to specifics within that podcast, you're welcome to.
So it's interesting, because actually the conversation we were having a minute ago in some ways
Yeah.
relates to this, because one of the ideas is, how does wisdom frame the world, and how does it relate to the idea of creation, or God as creator? So first, I think it's just valuable to say, and I think this came up in the other podcast as well, but there are a lot of similarities between Old Testament proverbs and what we call wisdom literature more broadly, and things we find in the ancient Near East. So a lot of the structure, this sort of the way proverbs work, is very similar to the culture. And we can see proverbs across cultures more broadly in general, right? Like pretty much every culture has a version of something that they would call proverbs, right? But some of the key differences are related to really the underlying theology of the Old Testament. So, for example, one of those big differences is God as creator. So God is the only God within within Jewish thought, and so this is very different than the polytheistic mini gods of the ancient Near East. And the story of God as creator also frames so much of what we see in the Proverbs, and I'd say in wisdom literature in general. So, this idea of God who created all things and therefore guides all things and shapes all things, um, is at the heart of what is wisdom. So wisdom is the foundation of the world. Is this idea within wisdom literature, and that the world was created in wisdom. So wisdom had a hand in the creation of the world, and that comes from God, who created everything. Now, if we compare that to other ancient Near Eastern cultures, sometimes they would have they do all have creation stories, but they had various levels of interest in how that related to wisdom. So for example, Egyptian creation stories didn't tend to have as much connection to wisdom, to their wisdom literature,
Mhm.
and in part it's because their creation stories tended to be more about like the creation of Egypt or the creation of particular parts of creation rather than all of the created world.
Mhm.
Mesopotamians had a little bit more of an importance of how creation related to their wisdom, but their models of how creation happened were very violent. And so when you look at Mesopotamian stories of creation, they're gods fighting each other and creating the world in part from like the slain bodies of gods. And so what it means to have the foundation as creation and wisdom means something pretty different when we think about how God creates in the Old Testament compared to these other creation stories. So that'd be one big thing. And so in the Old Testament, as we think about Proverbs, then God is the creator of all things. He founds and grounds everything else. And we come back to appreciating his creation as a way of connecting to his wisdom. So you see in Proverbs lots of references to animals and insects and flowers as a way of watching how they express wisdom, um, and then the ways that human beings can be like that. And that reflects the goodness of God's creation. So then another one is around the role of king. So if we do like a little triangle for what's important in wisdom literature, you have the king in relationship to human beings, in relationship to the created world, and underneath is the grounding of wisdom. And so human kings were really important in the ancient Near East in relationship to wisdom. So the king was seen as like the figure of order and structure. And so a lot of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature like points back to kings and like what the kings can do. So it's interesting because how the gods in those myths related to the king, the human king, was very different than how human kings are represented in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, human kings are human beings who may or may not do the right thing. And we see this if we look at, well, First and Second Kings or First and Second Samuel, or like any of the books that are about kings tell us that human kings can be good in following God or cannot be. And so the king as the source of all order or justice, the king as sort of the high point of wisdom, isn't seen that way in the Old Testament.
Mhm.
And so God as the great king is seen that way, but human kings are faulty. And so in Proverbs, rather than having a whole lot of language about a human king, there's a lot about God as king. And so that would be another kind of difference. And I think overall, just the reverence and the fear of the Lord as being the source of wisdom is again a different starting place. So while the ancient Near Eastern people had reverence for their gods, there wasn't just one God who is the source of all things, the source of all wisdom. And so, in its most basic sense, that's at the heart of some of those differences.
Yeah, I don't know what else I can really add to what you said, Beth. It's maybe
Yeah.
besides maybe nuancing that part of the difference with the ancient Near East was that they already started from a framework that there were multiple gods or multiple
Mhm.
Mhm.
divine beings out there, and that they all had their essentially their turf to play. And so, in some sense, the wisdom literature of other ancient Near Eastern cultures couldn't really be unified around creation because then you're basically cross-pollinating and then also interacting between one deity with another deity in two different maybe domains. and
Mhm.
and the Israelite, you know, view of the cosmos was that there is only one creator. There may be a lot of spiritual beings, there may be a lot of rivals, but they are not the creator. Everything came
Mhm.
from one source, from one creator. And that is probably, like, I agree that this is definitely one of the most unique things about the Israelite wisdom literature, is that it's so grounded in
Mhm.
creation. This concept of the calling
Mhm.
back to before the world was formed, before the land came out of the waters, before anything was created. Ultimately, it always refers back to this
Mhm.
basic concept of creation, which
Mhm.
I think as moderners, as 21st century folks, we tend to overlook, that we
Mhm.
approach wisdom literature without understanding that creation is such an underlying foundation of their worldview, that
Mhm.
we then can misinterpret or misunderstand the wisdom literature, because if we don't come to them with, okay, I get it, you guys think Yahweh is really, really great and that he's the creator of everything. If we don't come with that understanding, then we're going to misunderstand why they make such a big emphasis about the waters and how God had set the boundaries of those waters. Why did he create all these various animals and the beauty of all this? It's like there's this kind of underlying assumption that the Israelite had in his or her mind about why we exist and where did all this come from.
Yeah.
um, but at the same time, I think, like, what to reference to the last podcast, I think I mentioned something about, like, some of the Egyptian proverbs from, like, a minimum mape. I'm trying to remember how to say his name exactly, but
Mhm.
that there were proverbs and wisdom snippets that even the Israelites acknowledged. Oh, that's actually a pretty good one. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it probably would be good to actually respect each other's boundaries lines
Yeah.
for one's farmland. That's a general good piece of
Mhm.
wisdom. We probably should maybe grab that. We'll take that because all truth is still God's truth, and we'll just use that
Yeah.
in our concept. But it doesn't change or alter that the ground foundation of our wisdom literature is coming from a creator God.
Yeah, and I think
Mhm.
something else I that you as you bring that up, I think there's another piece to it, which is so when we think of God as creator, there's a separation between God, who is the creator, and what he creates.
Hmm.
And that separation doesn't happen in the same way in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So there's the sense of that the gods are nature, so they don't just control nature or create it, but they actually, in a sense, are that natural thing. So they
Mm.
are the storm, they are the rain, they are the Nile, they are, and so that also affects what you were talking about whether ancient Near Eastern myths can have like a cohesive wisdom and this
Hmm.
idea of creation together, because if a god is a tree and a god is rain and they have different personalities and they have different goals, you're not going to have a
Mhm.
unified picture of creation, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be, as in Mesopotamian literature, at war with each other, or at the very least in tension with each other about
Yeah.
what is right.
Right.
Whereas if you have God, who is creator, who is separate from creation, um, then you're going to have a perspective of this one God who sees all things and is in control of all things. And so I think that's another. It's a like maybe a more fine point distinction of
Yeah.
some of the ways they thought in the ancient world.
Mhm.
There was a scholar I remember reading. His name is John Hilber, and he talked about how that Tiamat is both a goddess, a sea serpent,
Mm-hmm.
and also the sea,
Mm-hmm.
all at the same time. And he talked
Yeah.
about how in the ancient Near Eastern world, the concept of the abstract and the concrete were not as separated as our modern minds like to have it, that they were actually very blended and melded together. That in the ancient mind, they could actually hold together in their concept. Oh, there's a goddess that is both a goddess, the sea, and a sea dragon, basically, at the same time. And it made sense in
Mhm.
their minds. And for
Mm-hmm.
us, we're just like, how does that even work? and, uh, that was not a problem for the ancient Near Eastern world. But then I could also see why in the Old Testament, there are these moments where Yahweh is making it very clear, I am not the fire.
Yes.
I am not the wind. I am not the earthquake, right? There's that famous scene of Elijah coming up to meet with God after he's running away
Mhm.
from Jezebel, and there's the
Mm-hmm.
fire, the wind, and the earthquake. And the writer specifically mentions, yet Yahweh was not in them. Yahweh was not in that. Yahweh was not in that.
Right.
And then he came.
Yeah.
To actually make it very clear. The typical ancient Near Eastern mind is, oh, you must be like Baal. Baal is lightning. Baal is the rain. Baal is the fertility. It's like, no, I am not those things.
Yeah.
That's good. Wow, that's good, you guys. Man, I'm learning all kinds of stuff as I'm listening to y'all talk. This has been just a really great conversation so far, helping people really understand how they should read Proverbs and how to deal with the tensions that exist. And I don't know, I appreciate you guys going back and forth and taking the time to kind of nuance some of those things out. Why don't we jump to a quick commercial break, and then I want to come back and we're going to hit some questions on Song of Songs. So if things get a little bit spicy, be forewarned. And then we will wrap up this episode. So let's jump to a quick break. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch-up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at AWKNG.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast. Well, welcome back, everyone. We are excited now to jump into the book of Song of Songs. So like I said, if things get a little bit spicy, hang with us. Hopefully it will be a fun and dynamic conversation. And here is the first question, which I think is a good one to start with. It says, besides maybe for marriage counseling or alluding to Jesus and the church, how else can pastors use the Song of Songs for Bible studies or even normal Sunday sermons? So what are your thoughts on that?
So I first want to I'm going to end up doing a little history lesson before we get into the answer to this question. I'm going to start by just saying that the reason we struggle with, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we struggle with this book. So one of the things to understand is that we, as a church more broadly, tend to avoid talking about sexuality in our services, whether that's in Bible studies or that's in front of everybody. We just have a tendency to not talk about sex. And there's a problem with that, because actually sexuality is a deep part of who we are and how we're made. And it means that sometimes people avoid some of the more difficult things that are actually central to a part of who they are, because as a church, we're not willing to have those conversations. So I'm going to start by saying that I actually think that there's a practical purpose to using the Song of Songs that's about opening up conversation that's actually very difficult for people to have. So why do we have this history of avoidance of talking about sexuality? Like, where does it come from? Well, if we look at the history of perspectives on sexuality, we have among some of the earliest church fathers not only an avoidance of sex, but viewing sex as dangerous and as to be avoided entirely in order to be spiritual.
Yeah.
So because of this, we get some of the early church fathers who did things like actually mutilate their bodies because they didn't want to have sexual desire. Or one famous example is someone who ran into a thorn bush anytime he thought about sex, because he was trying to avoid sexual thoughts. And so instead of like working through or finding a way with scripture to engage those thoughts or in trying to understand them, he ran into a thorn bush to hurt himself every time. So when we think about
wild.
So when we think about these early church fathers and how that shapes what we see today, we have this history where sexuality is hidden from the church. And the only time it's talked about is occasionally around marriage, but even that doesn't actually always happen when we look at the history of the church. And so, and the other problem with it is that it has so historically been viewed negatively that we have a dynamic, especially with men writing about it, that women are either chaste or dangerous. And so
Mhm.
this creates a whole lot of issues when we're trying to talk about healthy sexuality. So when we're to even get to the point where we talk about Song of Songs and whether we could use it or not, we have to face this history of how the church has dealt with sexuality. And I remember growing up, I was part of the True Love Waits era, like where we had a whole
Mm.
lot of I had like a wedding ring for Jesus, and and I remember I remember asking my pastors, and when I was getting into I think I might have been at the end of high school or beginning of university, and just asking, I was like, okay, so something I don't understand. So if sex is bad, then why, when you get married, it's immediately good?
Yes.
So how do I don't know what to do with that, because
It's
it
so
Mm.
seems
funny. I had
like,
that same question as a kid growing up. That was always my question because I grew up in a similar scenario like you mentioned.
yeah. And so when we are raised this way, or when churches either avoid talking about it or
Mhm.
lean into the sexual temptation equals bad equals, here's all the bad parts about sexuality, then what you can get is actually a really difficult space, not just for kids or teenagers, but even for adults, single adults, for example, finding spaces in the church to try and understand how they view their bodies, how they view sexuality, and then as you move into marriage, there's a lot of research of coming out of churches that have that view, and then people struggling with healthy marital sex, because it takes so much to undo that thinking of sex as bad, without the
Mhm.
nuance of kind of a bigger picture of thinking about sexuality. And what I love is that the Song of Songs is a book a lot about sex. Like
Mhm.
it's love poetry, but like very visual and very detailed love poetry that includes sexual imagery in it. And
Mhm.
that and if we think again about the history of its interpretation, I mentioned all of these early church fathers who struggled with sexuality, positive pictures of sexuality. Guess who said this is an allegory for Jesus and the church? Right?
Hmm.
It's the
Augustine.
same people, right?
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
those, and
They're
so
trying to
some of
reason it. Yeah.
yeah, and some of if you actually go and read those texts, some of them are really weird. So, for example, there's a section where it talks about the two breasts of the beloved. And
Mhm.
one interpreter read that as the Old Testament and the New Testament. So you have to lie between the breasts of the Old and the New Testament. And I don't know that's great interpretation. I don't really think it's great interpretation. So I understand that there is a history of reading these texts spiritually, and I don't think we need to remove the spiritual nature or the possibility of spirituality in these texts. I do think that a one-to-one verse for verse trying to read it spiritually can be very problematic and cause
Mhm.
very strange readings like I was just talking about. So if we don't do that, then what can we do? Well, first
Yeah.
of all, the Song of Songs is a picture of mutuality. So the song has the voice of both the man and the woman throughout, and their love for each other is pictured as something they both feel. So,
Mhm.
unlike the stereotypical cultural view of like men want sex, women don't somehow, or women don't have those feelings, Song of Songs actually shows us a picture where she is longing and he is longing, and they're figuring out what that longing is going to look like and what they're going to do with it, which I think is a really profound thing to talk about, and to be able to preach about, is that sense of mutuality.
Mhm.
Um, there's also a sense of the willingness to wait for what is good. So famous verse, "O daughters of Jerusalem, do not stir up or awaken love until it's ready," from Song of Songs
Mhm.
8:4. And so there's a sense of not rushing into things, and not engaging in sexual acts before you're actually in this space. That's the right thing to do. And there's a
Mhm.
preserving of the process leading up to consummation of that relationship, and it's beautiful. because they admire each other, they long for each other. We see the way they're dreaming of each other and expecting each other as they wait. And this phrase of "do not stir up or awaken love" like is over and over again throughout the text as they try to work through all these desires they have. And I actually think it's really helpful for people, whatever stage they're in, to know that that is a natural and biblical picture, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
frowned upon that people have these desires. It's really about, do they awaken it before they should, right? And so having those desires, having those imaginations for the one that will be the one that you're with, right, isn't considered a negative thing. It's really how you act on that. And there's a protection and a care that comes with that. Also, we see the way that they care for each other. So mutuality not only in desire, but mutuality in care. One of the emphases in throughout it is the way that they are loving and caring to each other. They listen to each other. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is the role of the community. So we often in our individualist society treat sex as a thing that only happens between two people that has no effect on anyone else. But it's not actually true. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we it, our sexuality affects others around us, and the way we can live in positive, healthy ways is to actually build community where we share the things that we're struggling with around sexuality, and where we can talk about being accountable to others. So the beloved doesn't just say to herself, "Do not stir up or awake before it's time." She says it to the daughters of Jerusalem. And there's a sense of accountability by saying that. She is asking others to help her to not arouse or awaken love before it's time. And I think this
Right.
sense that as a church community, we actually can like love each other and care for each other in ways that help each of us to have healthy sexuality. I think if we broke down some of the avoidance or some of the sense of bad versus good, just really actually thinking about how do we help people to seek mutuality, to seek care, to have patience in their love for
Mm-hmm.
each other, to be accountable to others, to both encourage them and to hold them accountable. I think all of that is actually really healthy things to preach about.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's only to married people. I actually think by the time you're married, while it can be helpful, I actually think it's kind of sometimes a little late to have that. So if we were doing that all the time, like we were having Bible studies about it, or we were having sermons about it, I think it actually could be really helpful for everybody. There is a great book about this, by the way, that I recommend to everyone. It's called God Loves Sex, which I think is hilarious. But it is co-written by Trimper Longman, who is an Old Testament scholar who studies
Mhm.
Song of Songs, and by Dan Allender, who is a psychologist, a Christian psychologist.
Hmm.
And they talk about, they have an imagined scenario of a Bible study going through Song of Songs and the different people and how they might respond to trying to think about the Song of Songs. And in between are biblical explanations of like what's happening in these passages.
Hmm.
And it's really helpful because it's a lot of the things I just talked about like come up in the book, and it tackles a lot of different experiences, whether somebody's had lots of different kinds of sexual encounters and feels afraid that they can't really be a Christian because God worried that God can't cleanse them or help them through that. People who have gone through various kinds of abuse around sexuality, people who have never had sex and are worried about that in their later life. Like, just there's a lot of different kind of issues that
Mhm.
people might have, and they have characters with each of those issues and work through them together as a community, which I
Hmm.
think is really profound.
Yeah. Sounds like a great resource. Mike, any
I'm gonna
thoughts?
I'm gonna tread carefully here. well, I mean, as you were talking, Beth, about the skewed ways that some of the early church fathers had towards sex, sexuality, marriage, even, it immediately brought up the fact that I've been bit by bit reading this book called Marriage, Celibacy, and Heresy in Ancient Christianity by David Hunter. It's I think it's
Mm.
his dissertation. But the reason I even got onto this book was because of a, a book conversation that I've essentially been having with another Christian author. She's a single Anglican deaconess, I think, in the Anglican Church. Her name is Danielle Turkwick, and she wrote a book 2 years ago that was featured at ETS 2023, The Meaning of Singleness. And she
Mm.
referenced that book, and so I've been kind of digging down into a little bit of that history. But it is fascinating because I know of folks like Ambrose, for example, who really was fascinated with the virginity of Mary, and and that some of that kind of skewedness towards sexuality and marriage even was because, in many ways, for about 3-4 centuries in the early church, many Christians expected might not live that long, might be persecuted, might actually have to even be martyred. And so
Mhm.
there was almost like this built-in expectation in the discipleship of the people in the early church to be ready to give a testimony, to even surrender your body to the flames, essentially. And
Mhm. Yeah.
then we have that moment with Constantine, where Christianity no longer was persecuted. And that the expectation to even lay down your life for Jesus was not a given anymore. And so folks like Ambrose, I remember reading in his works, they struggled with that because they grew up with this expectation. I'm not going to live very long. I might die pretty young, and I must be ready to lay down my life. And so they sought a way to still channel that zeal and that fervency. And the solution apparently that they found, so many of them, was towards celibacy, dedicated
Mhm.
celibacy. That it was in some sense a martyrdom, but a martyrdom of your future generations. That you were giving up a
Mhm.
future for your name, for your family, for your clan.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you're laying it all down and dying to all of that for the sake of Christ. And so they started using that, and that's why they started looking at Mary and other folks as like exemplars of that kind of life,
Mhm.
of that you can channel this martyrdom kind of spirit towards, you know, sexual purity in like the most strictest of senses. um, but of course, obviously, the reason that book even got written was because it got to an extreme where
Yeah.
essentially some of the church fathers basically made it sound like getting married was a complete sin. And eventually you will have folks like Augustine who will rise up and try to bring a moderating position in the middle within the church of, no, we kind of still do need marriage, because if Jesus hasn't returned yet, we kind of need people to keep on propagating the faith. Otherwise, there won't be
Right.
anyone around in the church.
Yeah.
And so he saw that it's a little zealous, it's a little too far, guys, and we need to kind of pull that back and not make people who get married feel as though they're doing something wrong. That it's not a sin. Um,
Mhm.
the only other anecdote I guess I would bring up is that I totally understand that um, that kind of typical culture within evangelical churches that was really hyped up on like purity culture. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know if it's because the church that I grew up in was a Chinese heritage church, and so you would think at one moment that they would probably be very, very much on that kind of like ultra purity culture. But maybe it's because in the English congregation, you had more American-born Chinese folks who were a little bit more realistic. And I just remember as a young Christian, I was in my senior year in high school, and the youth counselor who was my mentor and mentored a bunch of other guys in our young guy Bible study, he got married. And that was kind of sort of like the closing chapter of our youth Bible study. I was getting ready to graduate from high school. And when he got married, we met with him one more time as a Bible study. Um, and we were all excited to hear how was the first wedding night.
Mm.
And like, I don't know why we wanted to ask that question. I mean, obviously because we're teenagers and just like, But we were like thinking like, oh, like yes, we want to find out from our mentor, like what was it like on the first wedding night? And he shocked us. I don't think he intended to shock us. He just simply told us that on the first night that he and his wife were able to consummate, to be finally intimate with one another, that he said that after they had done that he then sat up, kind of sat on the side of the bed, and he started weeping. And a bunch of us guys, 17, 18-year-olds, were just like, wait, what? and that he explained that because he had childhood cancer when he was 11. And he had assumed that he would never get married, let alone ever have children, because of what the cancer, the side effects, the chemo, everything, what it had left behind. And that he would never get married because no woman would want to marry him. And so for him to have that night, like it just turned into, for him, a moment of praise and worship of God. And I just remember, like, that obviously has stayed with me ever since.
Yeah.
And it has struck me so deeply because, like, I saw this is why he is my mentor. I didn't grow up in the church. I did not know anything about what it meant to be a good Christian. But I saw in his own testimony, his own explanation for why he felt what he felt. It rocked me.
Yeah.
And like, that has stayed with me ever since, of the preciousness, and not just the preciousness, but the sacredness of the relationship between a husband and a wife, and of that moment that is between them alone. That it was just such a weird contrast. Here's a bunch of us 17, 18-year-old, like, hormone driven guys, and yet we're just completely speechless before what really, I look back now, was like a true guy, a true man. Of like, holy cow. It's just like, I want that. I want that moment. I want to have the character to be able to have such a privilege and a blessing like that. That's not something you could just force. That really was something from just his own experiences and just the blessing of God in his life. And so I think, that's kind of partly my perspective, and why when I look at the Song of Psalms, it's like, I totally get that. The whole entire mutuality of like, that's awesome.
And the fact that he was able to talk about it, because I think that something so profound is that he was willing to share with you, right? And I think that if there's space to have those conversations, there's space to actually to understand that sacredness, right? In a way that if we avoid those conversations, we lose the opportunity to talk about that and to have a lot of healing for people, honestly. I wanted to go back to something else you said. I just really appreciate, I want to be clear that I am not saying in any way against something about celibacy. I actually believe that singleness and celibacy is a God-given path that is really clear in the New Testament. Paul talks about that being like a positive way to go if you don't feel so much that you need to have a relationship, right? And so I think one of the other things we struggle with is actually how to talk about singleness and people who choose singleness. Within other traditions that are not Protestant traditions, we have a lot more space for that. But one of the things I think sad is that actually our emphasis on marriage within Protestant circles has left out the possibility of singleness as a calling or as a space. So I appreciate that you brought that up, because I actually think when we talk about Song of Songs, we tend to emphasize sexuality and in married life, which is important. On the one hand, it's important for us to talk about that. On the other hand, it's also important for us to see that that singleness is and celibacy is actually a possibility of what God might call some people too, as an act of worship to Him too. So I think that's also important.
That's
Yeah,
great.
and even that author that I had mentioned, Danielle Turtwig, like she herself has been a single for all her life, and I think that's been one of the powerful testimonies about her, was finding that there is still purpose and actually goodness in that
Mhm.
life path.
Hmm.
Even when I got a chance to talk with her during 2024 at the last ETS, and one of the things I really appreciated about her book was just this acknowledgement that the church has overemphasized, as though marriage is the, like, in some sense it's so funny. The early church swung one way, that
Yep.
celibacy, singleness is the holiest path of all. And now,
Mhm.
in our modern times, we swung to the other direction of marriage is the only real possibility to have a godly life, because you need to
Mhm.
have a partner or a spouse or however else. And yet there is really more of a and both scenario
Yeah.
that's going on. And
Yeah.
um, and just for for my own self-disclosure, like my wife and I are a childless couple.
Mhm.
And as I shared that with Turdwick, that's one of the things that I noted that she kind of mentioned, was that there is an interesting synergy that happens between singles and also childless couples. That
Mhm.
there seems to be like an understanding of, yeah, that in the culture we tend to see within evangelicalism, we're sort of in that liminal space. We're both in separate liminal spaces, and
Mhm.
yet because of that, we can actually understand each other's struggles a lot more than the typical folks within a church, because yeah, we're
Mhm.
not exactly fitting in the propped up model of the best godly Christian life, right? There's this interesting kind of like, we're in this space of tension, and
Yeah.
yet it is a good tension.
Yeah. I, because of a medical issue when I was young, I was told when I was 16 that I wouldn't be able to have children. And so part of my journey of really trying to understand these questions was for myself to say, well, what if I never have children? And what if I never marry? What is my life going to look like? Because I believe that God has a richness and a sacredness in those lives as well. And so I spent a lot of my 20s in that space of just asking God, what is the life you have for me? And
Mm.
assuming that children weren't going to be an option. So when I met with my husband, that was a conversation we had as well. Um, and I feel like there is people, as you said, Mike. I think that a lot of people never have the space to ask those questions. There's sort of an assumption about what their lives will be. And I
Hmm.
think that there's something beautiful that both childless couples and single people who choose singleness give to the church if we listen. And I think that that's
Yeah.
really important also, that we can hear each other.
I love that everything that you guys are saying really boils back down to just the fact of we just need to be able to openly talk about this stuff. It's like when you hide it or you shy away from it, you lose so much richness that could be gained not only for people individually but collectively as a community to learn from one another. So I love that you guys really highlighted that. I think that's a very key takeaway that we need to think about whenever we're reading this book, and being open to discussion around sexuality and within church settings. I think that's so important. Okay, let me hit one final question. I think this is going to be a fairly simple one, and then let's wrap up this episode. So this last question says, the study guide points out that the Song of Songs claims that Solomon is the author. I have heard from other teachers that this is uncertain. What do you think? Who do you think is the author and why? So, for listeners out there, we have a study guide that goes along with our reading plans. If you're listening to this and you have never engaged in the study guide, so this is what this question is referring to. So, Beth, why don't you touch on that? What are your thoughts on the author?
Okay, some basic things. The things we have at the start of books, they're called superscriptions, and they're often later additions to books. So things like Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, could be something that was added at a later time than the original writing. So that's part of where these questions come up. Also, which is Solomon's related to Solomon? That phrase in Hebrew is a little unclear. Is it about Solomon? Does it reference Solomon? Did Solomon write it? It's not a one-to-one where it's claiming Solomon wrote this or it's his song necessarily. It may have a little leeway that it may be referring to Solomon or in some other relationship to Solomon. So that's why you get these questions. One of the things is that Solomon isn't necessarily represented in the best light, and there's seems to be that the lover in the story is a shepherd. He is frequently taking his flocks places. A lot of the imagery that's used is much more of the kind of imagery of agriculture and of animals like lambs and goats and things like that. And so part of the question of the text is the lover Solomon? And the parts where Solomon shows up is more like a comparison than necessarily about Solomon. So there's a king that shows up, there's Solomon that shows up, but when he shows up, it's often a comparison. So, for example, in chapter 8, the beloved talks about Solomon and how he's got all of these, like all of this vineyard and all of these troops. And she says she would rather have her own than what Solomon has. And so it seems like in that setting, it's not that Solomon is her beloved, but that Solomon is compared to her beloved. And that she wants something that's actually not, she would rather have the thing that's not as grand as Solomon. And in a similar way, Solomon's described with a whole bunch of military troops and sentinels. And then later, the sentinels attack the beloved. They beat her up, which seems like a really weird thing that Solomon, if it doesn't really make sense that if Solomon is the one who's the lover, that he would allow for her to be beat up by sentinels. Like, so obviously some of that's metaphoric, but it does raise these questions. And also dating raises these questions. So some of the words in Song of Songs are Persian words. So either those are added later or it was written later. So those are some of the questions. And so I think all of that would lead me to not be completely sure that Solomon is the author of the book. And instead to see Solomon as a figure who's being compared to make points in the Song of Songs. That would be how I would typically take it.
Yeah, I think there years ago, Dr. Heiser one time he did a podcast episode about like Psalm 24, and he addressed the very beginning subscript about how it's of David. And he pointed out that the preposition can be taken, it could have been written by David, it could have been written for David, it could have been written from David, it could have been written to David. It could, like, it was just like, it was just like, oh, there's so much breadth in how even a preposition could be used. That's kind of shifted my own way of thinking about the Song of Songs and even Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that these are more not necessarily, are they directly penned by Solomon, to more of, do they fit within a genre of literature that could be considered Solomatic, if I were to create a word, that it sort of has this pattern or this kind of rhythm in itself that one reads it, oh, this totally sounds like something that I could imagine King Solomon might have said or written or done or sang, that it would fit within that kind of genre of literature, but it does not necessarily mean that it was written by the very hand of Solomon as he's thinking about this one woman in light of the fact that he had hundreds of other brides in the background. Actually, like there's that complication.
I actually find it more problematic if it is Solomon who wrote it than if it isn't. And so this is something I say to people, like, sometimes we want to attach books to particular authors because they're in the Bible. But like, if you see their bigger story, I'm not sure that I think Solomon is doing this with this one particular woman, and then what does it mean that he has all these other women, and that actually his downfall
Right.
is women? Like, it actually makes the Song of Songs more problematic, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
And even what you mentioned earlier, Beth, about the soldiers mistreating, the bride. Like like if that was Solomon and that was his soldiers,
Right.
like
Yeah.
it makes me even more uncomfortable that it's Solomon.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But would you guys both agree that definitively we don't know who the author necessarily was and whether or not, and that's okay. I would say that that's the case for multiple books within the Bible, and it's okay, I feel like, to wrestle with that and read through the book with just basic understanding of what you're reading and say, okay, well, hey, that might not make sense, and that's okay that it might not be be the case.
Well, I think our idea that there has to be an author we know for something to be meaningful or
Right.
truthful it comes actually from I'd say a later modernist kind of way of reading. So,
Mhm.
because later in history, there's a sense of like the great mind that created great literature, but they didn't necessarily struggle with that in the ancient world in the same way that we do. And
Mm.
so I think when we look at something like Hebrews in the New Testament, we don't know who wrote that. Does that make Hebrews not valuable or not worthwhile for our beliefs about who Jesus is or what it means to live in response to that or what it means to be faithful? I mean, I think we read that book the same way we read a letter of Paul or something that
Right.
Peter wrote or something. We don't we kind of say, "Oh, we don't know, but here's what we can do. Here's how we can read this." And I'd say that that's true when we're looking at a lot of Old Testament books as well. Sometimes we know and sometimes we really don't.
Yeah, that's
A-
great.
a-
Awesome.
And
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I would just simply also point out that I think sometimes like we get really obsessed with the question about the authorship, but we're not even reading what the author wrote. So
Right.
so even if we come to agreement that this is written by Solomon, but at the same time, earlier in the podcast, we even mentioned that the wisdom literature, including Song of Songs, is often ignored. So in
Mhm.
some sense,
Yeah.
in my mind, it's like I would rather people be confused or unsure of who the author is, but they will still read it,
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
than to
Yeah.
know who the author is and then never read it.
Yeah.
Mhm. It's true. Very true. Let's just read the text, not get bogged down if we don't know an answer of who wrote it. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for this conversation. I think this was a really great episode of just diving in and working through several things that we encounter in those two books. So, as we wrap up, Dr. Stovell, is there any resources that you would like to share? I know you shared some when you were with us originally a couple of months ago, but is there anything new that you're working on, or a website, or anything you'd like to direct listeners to?
Um, I think it's pretty similar to what I was working on before. I'm still finishing off a commentary on the Minor Prophets, which will be coming out pretty soon. Um,
Yep.
and I am working on a book that will be a couple years out, but working on a book about biblical metaphor and how do we use it, and how does it help us better understand the Bible. So you can keep looking for those. I post about them on Twitter and Facebook, and you can find out more also on my Ambrose page for Ambrose University. So,
Awesome. Awesome. Great. Well, let us ask you our little fun final question. We had to come up with some new fun questions since we've already asked you our standard ones. So our question for you today as we end is, what is your favorite thing to eat? What's your favorite food, your go-to?
oh man, gosh, so hard. Depends on the day. Yesterday we had something that I really love, which is enchiladas.
Mm.
Yeah, I particularly like. I made for Father's Day. I made chicken verde enchiladas, so like the green
Oh,
sauce,
yeah.
as very very delicious. I'm from Texas, so I like a lot of Tex-Mex food. So let's just
Okay.
say that I'm not sure it's my actual favorite, but it's on my list.
Yes. Oh, that sounds good. I'm gonna have to add that to my menu in the next couple of weeks. Enchiladas. That sounds awesome. Oh, great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you back again for another episode as we dive into the book of Ruth. All those that are listening, thank you for joining. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, leave us a review, and we will see you right back here next time. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at AWKNG.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit AWKNG.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.